November 7th, 1956. British paratroopers are dug into Egyptian sand. The canal is secured. The operation is working. After days of bombardment, after years of planning, after a century of dominance in this region, Britain is winning. Then the phone rings. Washington is calling, and Washington is not congratulating them. Within 48 hours, Britain will order a full ceasefire. Within a week, British troops will begin withdrawing from Egypt. Within a month, the Prime Minister will resign in disgrace. Within a year, the entire world will understand what happened in those 7 days. The British Empire did not end with a war. It did not end with a revolution. It ended with a phone call. This is how the most powerful empire in human history was humiliated in a single week, and why no one saw it coming. At its height, the British Empire controlled nearly a quarter of all the land on Earth. 1 in 4 human beings alive in 1900 lived under the British flag. The Royal Navy patrolled every ocean. British banks financed every continent. British law governed territories from Canada to India to Australia to Egypt. When London made a decision, the world felt it. The empire was not just a political structure, it was a belief system, a conviction held genuinely, deeply across generations of British politicians, soldiers, and citizens that Britain had a natural right to shape the world, that British civilization was the highest form of human organization, that the empire was permanent. That belief would prove to be the most dangerous thing Britain ever carried, because by 1956, the empire was already dying. It just refused to admit it. The Second World War broke Britain financially. In 1945, Britain emerged from the war on the winning side and completely bankrupt. The war had cost Britain roughly a quarter of its national wealth. It owed billions to the United States. Its industrial base was exhausted. Its military was stretched across every continent, trying to maintain territories it could no longer afford. The United States and the Soviet Union had emerged from the war as the 2 genuine superpowers. Britain sat in an uncomfortable middle position, too proud to accept it was no longer a first-rank power, too weak to actually behave like one. Between 1945 and 1956, the cracks became impossible to ignore. India, the jewel of the empire, gained independence in 1947. Palestine collapsed into crisis. Egypt itself had already seen British troops forced out of Cairo. Across Africa and Asia, independence movements were accelerating. Britain was losing an empire in slow motion, and its political class responded the only way it knew how, by pretending it was not happening. The Suez Canal was not just a waterway. Built in 1869, the canal cuts through Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Before the canal, ships traveling from Britain to India had to sail around the entire continent of Africa, a journey of months. The canal reduced that journey to weeks. For the British Empire, the Suez Canal was the central artery of its global power. Oil from the Middle East flowed through it, troops moved through it, trade moved through it. Control of the canal meant control of the most strategically important 193 kilometers of water on the planet. Britain had effectively controlled the canal since 1882. It owned a major shareholding in the Suez Canal Company. It maintained a military base along the canal zone for decades. The canal was, in the minds of British policymakers, as British as the Thames. Egypt had other ideas. On July 26, 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser delivered a speech in Alexandria. For 2 hours he spoke. He spoke about colonialism. He spoke about humiliation. He spoke about the Egyptian people's right to control their own territory and their own resources. And then, embedded in the middle of that speech, he delivered the words that would detonate a crisis. Egypt was nationalizing the Suez Canal. The Canal Company would be taken over by the Egyptian government. The revenues from canal traffic, which had flowed to British and French shareholders for nearly a century, would now fund Egypt. Specifically, Nasser announced they would fund the construction of the Aswan High Dam after the United States and Britain had withdrawn their offer to finance it. In London, the reaction was fury. Prime Minister Anthony Eden compared Nasser directly to Hitler and Mussolini. He told his cabinet that Nasser could not be allowed to have his hand on Britain's windpipe. The canal had to be taken back, by whatever means necessary. Britain began planning a military operation to retake the canal. What happened next was one of the most cynical pieces of political theater in modern history. Britain could not simply invade Egypt. That would look like naked imperialism, which is exactly what it was, and would be impossible to defend at the UN. So Britain, France, and Israel constructed a secret agreement. Israel would invade Egypt across the Sinai Desert. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum to both sides demanding they withdraw from the canal zone. Egypt would refuse. Britain and France would then intervene militarily, not as aggressors, but as peacekeepers protecting the canal from the conflict. It was a fabrication from start to finish, a pretext for an invasion that had already been planned and agreed in secret weeks before Israel fired a single shot. The operation began on October 29, 1956. Israel invaded Sinai. Britain and France issued their ultimatum exactly as scripted. Egypt refused exactly as expected. British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields on October 31st. For approximately 72 hours, it appeared to be working. Washington had not been consulted. This was not an oversight. Britain knew the United States under President Eisenhower would not approve. Eisenhower was in the middle of a presidential election campaign. He had spent years trying to position America as the defender of self-determination against Soviet imperialism. A British and French military operation to retake a former colonial asset in the Middle East was the last thing he needed. Within 48 hours, Britain would order a full ceasefire. Within a week, British troops would begin withdrawing from Egypt. Within a month, the Prime Minister would resign in disgrace. Within a year, the entire world would understand what happened in those 7 days. The United States immediately moved against Britain at the United Nations, joining the Soviet Union and calling for a ceasefire resolution. The Soviets went further, threatening to intervene militarily on Egypt's behalf and hinting at the possibility of nuclear strikes on London and Paris. But it was not the military threat that broke Britain, it was the financial one. The British pound was under severe pressure. Currency markets were selling sterling. Britain's dollar reserves were draining at an alarming rate. Britain needed emergency financial support from the International Monetary Fund to stabilize its currency. The United States controlled the IMF, and Washington made its position clear: no ceasefire, no financial support. Britain was not defeated militarily in Egypt. Its forces were winning on the ground. Britain was defeated in Washington, in the currency markets, in the cold arithmetic of a country that could no longer afford to act like an empire. On November 6, 1956, less than a week after the bombing began, Britain announced a ceasefire. The withdrawal was humiliating in every dimension. British troops left Egypt. The canal remained under Egyptian control. Nasser, far from being removed, emerged from the crisis as a hero across the Arab world and the developing world. He had faced down 2 European empires and a regional military power simultaneously and won. Anthony Eden resigned as Prime Minister in January 1957, citing ill health. The official story was that he was exhausted and unwell. The real story was that he had led Britain into the most catastrophic foreign policy failure of the 20th century, and the Conservative Party needed distance from the disaster. At the United Nations, Britain and France were exposed as the aggressors they had always denied being. The secret protocol with Israel, the fabricated pretext for intervention, eventually became public. The diplomatic damage was permanent. The United States completed its replacement of Britain as the dominant Western power in the Middle East. The special relationship between London and Washington survived, but on permanently altered terms. Britain now understood, viscerally and humiliatingly, that it operated within limits set in Washington. And across the empire, every independence movement in every colony watched what had happened. They had seen the moment Britain blinked. They had seen America force Britain to stand down. They had seen that the empire, which had seemed permanent, was in fact deeply fragile. The pace of decolonization accelerated dramatically after 1956. Within a decade, dozens of British colonies would become independent nations. The empire that had taken centuries to build dissolved within a generation of Suez. The British Empire did not end in 1956, but Suez was the moment everyone, including Britain, understood that it was ending. The fiction of British global power, maintained through habit and prestige and carefully managed appearances, collapsed in 7 days when it encountered the hard reality of what Britain actually was in 1956. A country of 50 million people, deeply in debt, dependent on American financial support, militarily capable but economically constrained. A regional power with the memories and the habits of a global one. Empires rarely end with a single catastrophic defeat. They end with a moment of clarity, a moment when the gap between what a power believes itself to be and what it actually is becomes impossible to ignore. For Britain, that moment was November 1956. The paratroopers in the Egyptian sand were winning. The empire was already lost.